It is very much a privilege to welcome you to the Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture Series today. My name is Jen Lansford. I am the Director of the Center for Child and Family Policy here. And the Center for Child and Family Policy, thank you. So the Center for Child and Family Policy sponsors these Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture Series to stimulate the intellectual community, not just here at Duke, but also in the Durham community, and now thanks to our online audience across the United States and in other countries as well. So we welcome folks who are participating via Zoom as well. So the Sulzberger series brings prominent researchers, policymakers, and thought leaders to campus to share their experiences on topics that impact child development and family well-being. The lectures are made possible through a generous donation from the Arthur Sulzberger family, and I'd like to particularly thank Cynthia Sulzberger and Stephen Green for their support. So today, we're very fortunate to have Kathryn Edin, William Church Osborn Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton University, Timothy Nelson, lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Princeton University, and team ethnographer Liv Mann, and they will be presenting findings from their new book, The Injustice of Place, Uncovering the Legacy of Poverty in America. And we are very grateful to you all for the copies of the book that you have very generously provided. So thank you. Kathryn Edin is one of the nation's leading poverty researchers and has authored 8 books and some 60 journal articles. Her book, $2 a Day, The Art of Living on Virtually Nothing in America, was met with wide critical acclaim and was included in the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2015, cited as essential reporting about the rise in destitute families. Dr. Edin is PI of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study, a trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation, was a founding member of the MacArthur Foundation-funded Network on Housing and Families with Young Children, and was a past member of the MacArthur Network on the Family and the Economy. In 2014, she was elected to both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. Tim Nelson is the author of numerous articles on low-income fathers and is the co-author with Edin of the book Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the Inner City. Currently, Dr. Nelson is working on a book with Dr. Edin and Laura Lane on the work of child support experiences of 440 low-income fathers interviewed in Philadelphia, South Carolina, Austin, and San Antonio, Texas. We'll also hear from Liv Mann, team ethnographer in Kentucky for the project. She's a 5th-year PhD student in sociology and social policy at Princeton University, and her research focuses on violence and the reproduction of inequality. So thank you very much for being here, and the floor is now yours.
Great to be with you all. This project, like all projects that I've ever been involved with, has an odd genesis. So as Dan mentioned, in 2015, I wrote a book with Luke Schaefer. It was really about America's poorest people. And a couple of years later, a program officer from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called us up. And she said, by the way, this never happened, so don't get excited. She said, would you be interested in turning your attention to America's poorest places? And could you do so with an eye toward health? And so we thought about this for a while, and almost immediately we got really excited about turning our lens from people to places. We learned a lot from the work of Roz Chetty and earlier work by sociologists like William Julius Wilson about the absolute essential nature of place. How many times place is more consequential to someone's life outcomes than their behavior, their genetics, the quality of their healthcare or their education. There was also a long history in sociology of studying place way back in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, the classic community studies, but they sort of fallen out of fashion. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought, why aren't more sociologists, social scientists studying whole communities? And why weren't we? So we said yes. And the rest is sort of history. Kathryn could point it back there because that's what really controls it. No. Oh, there we go. Okay, that's good. So the first thing we had to do is we had to figure out how to measure place-based disadvantage. Now, by this time, I'd spent my entire career studying poverty. And if you know anything about the study of poverty, the poverty definition wars are famous. They are bloody. People emerge from them bruised, their reputations ruined. How do we measure poverty? But really, all of these arguments were around increments to the income or income-based poverty measures. And since we developed the poverty measure many, many years ago, 65 years ago, and there were all these direct measures of well-being that had become available to the nation's growth in the data infrastructure. And so we didn't, what we care about when we talk about poverty is something deeper. We're talking really about well-being. And we can measure well-being directly. We wanted to keep poverty in our definition because poverty tracks very closely with material hardship. We also added a measure of deep poverty. That's the percentage of households living below 50% of the poverty line, because that captured America's poorest people, sort of the subjects of our prior book. Both of these measures are cyclical. They rise and fall with the economy, so that's important. But deep poverty is a little more sticky than just plain poverty, if you will. We also wanted, this is very jumpy, it's exciting. We also wanted to reflect the fact that one of the things we've learned about poverty is how it gets under the skin, right? Just because you have a spell of poverty and you get out of that spell, it doesn't mean that the damage it's done to your physical health just goes away, right? And the more spells of poverty you experience, the deeper poverty gets under your skin. So we chose two well-measured indicators of health, one at the beginning of the life course and one at the end of the life course to capture this. Low birth weight is a great measure because it really reflects the mother's cumulative experiences of disadvantage. It is very predictive of child health problems and indeed child outcomes across the life course. And then life expectancy, of course, captures a person's own history of poverty and adversity. And of course, these are all then measured at the community level. We use counties and cities for reasons we can talk about, but mainly counties are very important if you want to study rural America, because counties are the most important. I see my Appalachian friend there nodding. Yes, counties are in fact, if you meet a Southerner, they won't tell you what town they're from. They'll often tell you what county they're from because counties are so consequential to rural life across America. And we don't have many studies that incorporate all places in America and kind of offer an apples to apples comparison. Then we also wanted to capture structural definitions, dimensions of poverty. So in any given place, I see my teacher, sociology PhD student sitting right there. In any given place, there are different opportunities for moving ahead. So in some places like Belzoni, Mississippi, if you're a high school graduate, just about the best job you can get is in the catfish factory. But if you're in Boston, Massachusetts, you have many more opportunities than the catfish factory. And so we use Chetty et al. Measures of intergenerational mobility. This is the chances that a child born in poverty would end up in the middle class. And we captured those for every county, city in the nation. Now, there was no way of a priori way of weighting this index. And so what's more important, deep poverty or life expectancy? It seemed all really important. So we used a machine learning technique called principal components analysis to weight all of these factors. If you want to know more about that, don't ask me because I'm qualitative. And we were able to rank every county, all 3,100 counties in the country, plus the 500 large cities, and actually arrange them on a list. And here is what we found. I've got a little Duke blue around North Carolina for you all. I understand this is a sports school. So you can imagine the surprise of three co-authors who had spent their entire career studying urban poverty to discover that almost all of the clusters of deep disadvantage in the United States were, in fact, rural. And in particular, we saw strong clustering in 5 regions. First of all, the Central Appalachia. This is really Eastern Kentucky and Western West Virginia, most centrally. The Tobacco Belt, stretching Virginia to South Carolina. We're in the middle, we're just west, I believe, of the Tobacco Belt here in North Carolina. The Cotton Belt, fully 60 of the 100 most disadvantaged places in the nation lie in the historic Cotton Belt. These are the counties with the highest rate of enslaved people in 1860, and in South Texas. And South Texas is sort of everything below San Antonio. We also, although not clustered so much for geographic regions, see a very strong representation of Native nations. 20 of the 100 most disadvantaged places were, in fact, Native nations, but for various reasons, we were not able to include them in our full analysis, although we do write about Native nations a bit in our book. That's the next chapter. So when you ask any team of 3 people, 2 of whom are qualitative or ethnographers, what to do next to explore why we see this strong regional pattern, those people are going to say, oh, we need some ethnography. And indeed, that's what we did beginning in the fall of 2019 and stretching all the way through 2022. We embedded graduate students and other researchers, including some MPP students, in these regions. They actually lived in these regions, participated in all aspects of community life. One of our team members is here, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about that experience in a minute. And so we chose specific counties in each of these regions to explore ethnographically. But I want to emphasize here that when you read the stories in the book, you might think they knew about these stories before they picked these counties. Honestly, we knew, right? We knew nothing. We simply picked not the very poorest, but the next to the very poorest place or most disadvantaged place, but we also made sure it had a population base large enough that we could actually live there. So Issaquah, Mississippi is simply too small. There's not enough people there, so we chose LaFleur County, Mississippi. That's just one example. And of course, Marion, South Carolina is on the North Carolina border.
So my role is to get up here a little bit and talk about working as part of this research team. And one of the things I really believe about this book, even if it's not the thing we get invited to give talks on, is that the methodologies we use really substantively contributed to the claims we were able to make. We were working as a research team of graduate students who were exploring these places all at the same time and sharing week to week the things we were finding. And it's not like we were writing up formal memos each week to share. It was a lot of, did you know, and fun facts. And as we were sharing those fun facts, though, we started to see these really surprising commonalities across our field sites. One day it was, did you know that Clay County used to be one of the salt centers of Appalachia? To the point, in fact, that the downtown in Clay County's county seat is actually decorated with painted salt kettles all over. And this was before coal, which we all already knew about. Then it was, did you know that Davila County is the spinach capital of the United States, and they have a statue of Popeye? Did you know that Marion County was a major site of tobacco production and that it's a part of the cultural history in that place? Playing just this did you know game as we were all experiencing our field sites at the same time was actually one of the most productive things that we could have done during our weekly meetings. And I think one of the big takeaways that I'm really excited to get to share is that team research works, and you get so many more ideas than you might have had before.
That is so true. And just want to give a shout out to all of the people on this screen. And by the way, they all co-own these data. They're writing dissertations and book chapters and articles on these data. So if you don't believe us, go read their work. You're probably going to learn more than you did from us. But it is really true that we learned so much in these team meetings. And it is also true that all of these regions were literally the world's capital or the United States capital of something or other, despite the fact that we hadn't chosen them for that reason. Then at one team meeting, one of our researchers, Ryan Parsons, who studied Mississippi, sent along this map. And so on the left is the rate of enslaved people in the United States in 1860 by county. On the right is our index of deep disadvantage. And what is so stunning about this map is the very gradation of the counties are the same. Now, I don't want you to get hooked on this. This is not going to be a talk about what happened before 1865. Indeed, all of the action in our story virtually is after the Civil War, well after the Civil War. But this pointed us to the first time to the reality that there was something deeply historical about our story that we needed to explore.
So those stories really clued us into the fact that something had happened a long time ago in these places. And one of our research questions was, these are very different regions. Is there some commonality that we can talk about at some level that is true to all of them? So I was designated, I guess, the historian of the group. So during the COVID, when we couldn't really go and do any field visits and so on, we amassed all kinds of secondary sources, primary sources, anything that we could find really on each of our regions. And what we came up with was this idea that each of these regions was the center of a single commodity, very extractive, very labor intensive. So you have the tobacco belt, the cotton belt. South Texas is the winter garden region that we were in, which was the center, as Liv said, of spinach and other kind of table vegetables and so on. And then Appalachia, of course, with timber and then coal. And so we started reading extensively, and we came to think of, and this is in the book too, of these as internal colonies, in the sense that there was a vast exploited population of labor in each place, a tiny group of people who owned pretty much everything, the land, the resources, they controlled all the labor. And they really resisted any kind of competition of coming in these areas with different kinds of industry and so on and take away their labor force. Each of these areas, because it was a single commodity, they were linked to global and national markets. And so very volatile. Cotton and coal and prices were up. Things were good. Prices went down. The whole community was really devastated. The laboring classes, most in particular. Just to remind you of where we're talking about here. And because the economies were so dependent upon labor and sort of cheap, controllable labor, the kinds of labor practices that were put into place were very controlling and dominating in terms of suppressing any kind of labor activity, controlling the vote. So not only, of course, were African Americans excluded from the vote in the post-Reconstruction era South, but in South Texas, they had something called the white primary, where only white people could vote in the Democratic primary. And if you weren't, you couldn't get elected otherwise. The coal towns, basically, if you were a miner, the coal bosses would tell you who to vote for, and they were all kind of lackeys of the coal company. So there was widespread, deep suppression across the laboring classes. This is actually a picture of some Spanish workers in Zavala County, Texas, during the Depression era. And as Kathy mentioned, we're really looking at the period really between 1880 and 1930 is when these economies get most fully developed, and all of these kinds of practices are most fully entrenched. These are people working tobacco in South Carolina and also in the 1930s. The other thing we discovered is that the patterns we're seeing in the present go back to the founding of these communities, and that if we didn't sort of intervene 100 years from now, we would probably be looking at the same kind of map. And so really addressing what's happened in these places and the people who live there and the situation that's going on is really important. And it turns out that these were also the places that gave the war on poverty its face in the 1960s. This is a picture of Lyndon Johnson announcing the war on poverty on the front porch of an out-of-work coal miner in Inez, Kentucky, which is right in the Central Appalachian region. We actually went and found that very cabin and got a picture of it. But also Lyndon Johnson himself was during his college years, he needed to make some money. And so he took a teaching job in Cotulla, Texas, which is right next to the Winter Garden region. And he was so moved by, it was a Spanish language school. He was so moved by the poverty that he saw among the Mexican American children that later on it really spurred his dedication to launching the war on poverty in 1964. So all of these sort of inputs have definitely had their legacy. So one thing we did was not just look at past and present, but to understand that the economy that founded these places were very different now than they were in the pre-war era. Why were they still so disadvantaged? So a lot of the book is trying to uncover the mechanisms that keep these places disadvantaged decade after decade. And so that's where I'll hand it back over.
So this book was a book of surprises. And I have to credit our respondents from the ethnographic study with coming up with virtually all of the mechanisms, hypothesized mechanisms that you see on this screen. I probably could have guessed the bit about schools, but I was actually stunned by the degree to which that our respondents really told us the stories in one way or another that turned out to be most salient in the communities that we studied. I'm going to talk about two, and if we get time, we can go to the third. I'll talk about the loss of social infrastructure and about corruption. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the story of your own state and did a little quick and dirty analysis of North Carolina over the last couple of days. And all of these patterns, all of these mechanisms can be seen in the counties that are the most disadvantaged in North Carolina. So let's begin with the loss of social infrastructure. How many people have heard that term? Okay, so you've all heard of the term social capital, right? So social capital is the bonds that you make with other people to get support and to get ahead. Social infrastructure are the places, the convening spaces in the community that bring community members together and give you a place to build those social bonds. So think roller rinks, movie theaters, barbershops, beauty salons, all of these little local cafes, all of these places where people in the community come together and begin to build social bonds. During the Q&A, ask about churches, because that's an interesting story. And so when we arrived in Clay County, Kentucky, we did not have social infrastructure on the brain. But here's what we heard.
So we heard some really interesting stuff from folks in Clay County about the lack of social infrastructure in those spaces. That very first red quote on the screen was from a woman named Sweet Pea, who lived in this bright purple house that had been painted 2 different shades of purple by students who had come on mission trips to the county. She had been a teacher for years in Clay County and considered every student she ever taught to be one of her children's functions. And what she said was, based on those years of teaching, there's just nothing around here for kids. That's why they go to drugs. We heard similar stories from many of our respondents, and they completely took us by surprise. We had Dolly, who talked about parks for little kids and told us about the fact that a park had recently been plowed over for a highway that was actually going to nowhere. And we saw that highway, drove by it many times. It wasn't something that brought in any green spaces for people to play in, new businesses for people to get to know each other at. It was truly an absence and a visceral absence of places for people to be together. Bristol told us that they had movies a long time ago. And like I said, it's turned into a church, and there ain't nothing here for youngins to do. Down here, Marie said, they just want to build roads and drugstores. So it's not nothing that you can really do down here. And then just one other I want to throw in. I think we've got it on there from Travis, even though I was only supposed to read the ones in red. Travis is actually a man who is recovering from an opioid addiction with a Suboxone prescription. And at the same time, he was having to sell off his Suboxone pills each month in order to get 5 basic necessities for himself and his partner. And he was the one who told us that one of the best things for young people to do was hang out in the Walmart parking lot. This isn't a well-lit parking lot. It's not near any sort of things that would make it safe for children to play there. There's no police presence. There's no school. It's truly just a parking lot. So when we're talking about this loss of social infrastructure, it's not just that there's not good parks or there's not coffee shops to go to. It's that there is no place for people to come together and build that social capital.
And somehow we missed the memo in picking our sites that this region was indeed the opioid capital of the United States. More overdoses in this region than any other region. And Clay County was topping that list with 230 odd prescriptions in the county at the height of the epidemic for every man, woman, and child in the county. That figure, by the way, has come way down, but it's still at about 130 prescriptions for every man, woman, and child in the county. And what people were eager to do is offer us their diagnosis for that problem. The reason people are going to drugs, the reason young people are using opioids, methamphetamines, heroin, and other drugs is there's nothing to do. So you can think of social infrastructure like a net. When community bonds are strong, when social capital is rich, when people have gathering spaces to form those bonds, you can catch people before they fall. But when the social infrastructure corrodes, that safety net is rent and people begin to fall through the cracks. Now, because, I love big data as well as ethnography, we sought to test this idea. And we went to the only data source that I know of that captures social infrastructure and changes in social infrastructure over time. So that is the U.S. Census of Businesses. And we were able to look at it, the degree to which the social infrastructure in the place had declined. And then we were able to look at the rate of opioid overdose, the change in the rate in opioid overdose over time. And we found a very strong relationship between the two, stronger even than predictors that are often talked about when we talk about the deaths of despair, economic conditions, unemployment, wages. This relationship was stronger. But those data leave out parks, single proprietor institutions, and that sort of thing. So we don't want to hang our careers on this alone. And what we've done is try to find a bunch of proxies, close proxies for social infrastructure. Penn State has the measures of social capital that look just like our map of deep disadvantage, suggesting that social capital is weakest in our areas. These are measures of social capital gained from Facebook data by Raj Chetty and his team. And what's absolutely striking about this map, of course, we don't have change over time here like we do with the U.S. Census of Businesses, is that you can literally pick out the counties that are highest in our index, and they are the lowest in social capital based on Facebook data. So this is not proof, but it's prima facie evidence that people in Clay County, when they were offering a diagnosis for the epidemic of opioid overdose and death in their county, that they might have actually been onto something. So let's talk a little bit about corruption. Now, I'm from small town America, a tiny town of about 2,000 people with 1 stoplight, 7 churches, and 9 bars. And I've never thought of the words rural and corruption together. But then, once again, we went to Clay County. So we're really featuring Liv and her field research here. But another place we went, of course, was the Mississippi Delta. And does anyone recognize this face? I know at least one of you does. Okay, I think he used to play football. I've been told that. I'm not a sports Sorry, not a spokesperson. But this, in every one of our sites, there are instances of massive corruption. And so, of course, you've all heard the story of almost $80 million in TANF. This is the program meant to help the poorest children in America, was siphoned away from children in Mississippi and lined the pockets of many sports celebrities, including allegedly Brett Favre. He's paid some of that money back, but not all of it. He also paved the way for a new volleyball court to be built at the University of Southern Mississippi, his alma mater, with the money, with the TANF dollars, while his daughter was on volleyball team there. But there are many, many other instances of this money lining the pockets of people from DHS and nonprofit providers that were supposed to be providing services. But few people know that this all started in LaFleur County, Mississippi, which is, of course, the place where we were conducting our fieldwork, where a nonprofit leader got a favorable hearing from the governor of Mississippi, took over huge amounts of control over TANF dollars, and began this process of exploitation. Meanwhile, only 3% of the poorest state in America, only 3% of families applying for TANF were being approved. So just imagine the scope of this scandal and what it meant for families with children in the state. That's only one of many scandals I could talk about in the Mississippi Delta. Those of you who are from there are nodding your heads. So let's go for a minute to Zavala County, Texas. When we got to Texas, it was reeling from the fact that in the years prior to our arrival, nearly every county official, every member of the city council, except for one person, had been indicted for corruption or human trafficking and was in jail. So turns out this pattern of corruption goes back decades and decades and decades in this small place, starting really with the Anglo rule of the place, beginning about 1910. And of course, the Texas Rangers were helping out the white farmers or ranch owners control their labor. This is how this corruption all began. But the New York Times quipped this Texas town might be the most corrupt little town in America because of the reputation of corruption in this place that had produced at one point 80% of the nation's spinach and most of its onions. So huge farms. You could literally see farmland to the horizon in these places, but this long-term pattern of corruption. But of course, no place, whoa, where are we going? Nope. No place was corrupt as Clay County, Kentucky, when the pattern went all the way back to when the first white colonizers arrived in 1820 and began to set up family dynasties based on the very lucrative salt trade. So what we saw when we were in Clay County is slate after slate of local officials going to jail for various forms of corruption, including feeding money to drug dealers who were fueling illegal opioids coming into the community and actually conspiring with drug dealers and taking a part of the proceeds. So actually exploiting the bodies, local leaders actually exploiting the bodies of their own people. And what we see in all of these so-called internal colonies is this pattern of exploitation and pattern of corruption that marks these places from the very beginning, creates sort of an ethos of extraction. First, you extract salt, then you extract timber, then you extract coal. But in the meantime, you subjugate your labor force. You don't let them vote. You cheat your tenant farmers at settlement. You underpay your tobacco workers, and so on. And so this logic of extraction continues even to the present day. And here, what's being extracted in the county, and by the way, Manchester, the county seat, 1,800 people, 13 pharmacies. Can anyone guess why that is? Because you get in trouble if you distribute too many opioids. So they literally had to keep proliferating these clinics. One owner owns 4 of these clinics in order to produce that figure, 131 prescriptions for every man, woman, child in the county. So community officials fought back. Community residents fought back against these local elites. They organized with the help of 2 pastors, one of whom ran any of the social services Liv described, to organize a march against this corruption. And on a rainy day in May, it was unusually cold. They had threats, drug dealers calling them saying, we're going to drive cars into the crowd. Fully a quarter of the entire county population showed up to march against corruption. And what we do see in these stories are not only corrupt local officials, and that is rife, but also hometown heroes who stand up, like Pastor Ken, whose picture I'm going to show you in a minute, and really organize opposition to the corruption that they see in their community. So when you hear corrupt local elites, that's a major story of our book. We have a villain in this book, and that's the villain, but there are also these hometown heroes that are opposing the corruption and exploitation in these communities. And here's Pastor Ken of Manchester Baptist Church sitting in his church. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the other mechanisms we observed. First of all, separate and highly unequal schools. We know that schools are segregated today, as they were, unfortunately, in the 1960s. But what we didn't know is the history, kind of the extreme history of separate and unequal schools in these particular places. In South Texas, there was legal segregation, as was in the Deep South. And when that ended, there were all kinds of schemes to help segregation to persist. Most probably tellingly in the South were the standing up of hundreds and hundreds of segregation schools for white students, many times funded with public tax dollars, at least initially. When you hear talk of universal vouchers, note that many of these universal voucher programs are proliferating in the South. They're disproportionately represented in the 14 southern states. And that will funnel, many of these segregation schools still exist. And those schools are signing up to receive public funds once again, just as they did in the beginning. A second really surprising theme, probably because of my history in northern Minnesota, I didn't imagine that these places would be violent. But indeed, they are some of the most violent places in the United States, as if not more violent, as cities like Memphis and Chicago. So the average communities are deaths by interpersonal violence is one of the most trustworthy statistics we have, because violence can be reported in all kinds of uneven ways across jurisdictions. We can see that the average community has about 5. In the 200 places of greatest disadvantage, you see the rate is about 2. And of course, we see the rate at about 13 in America's most disadvantaged communities. And what we found through our ethnographic research was very revealing. When we talked to local activists, anti-violence activists in the community, especially in the south side of Greenwood, they said, well, the problem is hunger. And we said, what do you mean hunger? And what we learned is that not only were these places the most violent, they were the least socially mobile places in the country. Indeed, LaFleur County, I think, is 7th lowest in the nation. And the folk hypothesis out there is that people turn to violence when they have no hope of mobility. Now, if you think back to the history of these places, why did violence occur? To suppress labor, right? Extreme suppression of labor. So whites used violence as a way of keeping the have-nots, whether they be white, black, or Hispanic, down. So what we began to explore is, to what degree could it be that if a community is successful at keeping people down, like LaFleur County, is that in itself then going to spark further violence? And some quantitative work we did with Liv and Luke Schaefer finds very strong evidence that not only does violence lead to low mobility, but low mobility also leads to violence. So we're seeing communities trapped in a structural cycle of violence. We also saw systematic racism in government policy, especially in Marion County, South Carolina, where, as you remember, in the PD regions, those back-to-back hurricanes and storms, Florence, Matthew, the flooding created havoc in those communities. And we saw when the government came in to help, the whites benefited and the blacks were often included, partly because their land tenure was often in heirs property, and for all kinds of other reasons. So we find, as other studies find, that often when the government comes in to help, because of deeply embedded assumptions in our government policy, we end up exacerbating inequality rather than curing inequality. We also looked at the labor histories, the civil rights histories of each of these regions. In every single case, these were the cradle of civil rights activity. Hispanics in South Texas got the right to vote because of a group of cheerleaders and other activists in, Duval County. It's an amazing story we tell in the book. Of course, Greenwood, Mississippi, LaFleur County seat, was the headquarters of Freedom Summer back in the 60s. Fannie Lou Hamer hailed from the county next door, Sunflower County. So much of what happened in the civil rights movement was centered right in this county. And I could tell similar stories. The labor history of Central Appalachia and the great mining wars and the efforts to unionize there are epic stories. Whose side are you on? Right? Did I say that? The lyric, right? Whose side are you on? The famous ballad. But in every case, there was strong, sure, and severe elite backlash, often fairly successful. Then we saw just plain social reproduction in all of these places. So as these places tried to recover from their mono economies, many of them evolved into ever-evolving company towns where a single big employer controlled everything. We saw this continuing extraction theme of people this time, but not coal. We also saw continuing extraction in Zavala County due to fracking and the conversion of the starved farmland that resulted from fracking, turning much farmland into elite hunting lodges where you can hunt African wildlife. They call them exotic. And so you can pay $10,000 to kill a zebra. White-tailed deers cost more for reasons I could explain. We're also seeing in LaFleur and Marion the exploitation of H-2A visas. Longtime Black workers at local farms are being replaced by South Africans with these visas. In fact, they're being asked to train these workers and then they're fired. So if you look closely at the news, you'll see more and more examples of this. But this logic of extraction rather than investment continues. So I just wanted to say a little bit about North Carolina. I don't have the very, very western tip of the I apologize, of the state here where Cherokee County is. But you see two big clusters of disadvantage. There are 8 counties in North Carolina that are among the 100 most disadvantaged. See if I can move forward. So this is Scotland County. That's #1 most disadvantaged. This is Robeson County. This is about 98. This is Scotland County, I believe. This is 149. All of these are extremely disadvantaged, and of course they share the same history as does their neighbor right down here, Marion County. We wrote about. They were affected by the hurricanes and flooding as well. These are basically the bottom end of the tobacco belt. This is the top end of the tobacco belt, kind of the area really around Rocky Mount, North Carolina. And again, this was all it was later in the 1960s in cultivation of the bright leaf strain of tobacco, the first strain smooth enough to actually smoke, popularizing the cigarette. Here's a pattern of bright leaf cultivation as of 1960. So it lasted a long time. And Tim mentioned that he found the very house that where the bright leaf tobacco strain was first developed. There's kind of a lot of lore around this. Most of it is not true, but this is the farm in Caswell County, North Carolina, right below Danville, Virginia. So all of these mechanisms can be seen in these two clusters in North Carolina: corruption, loss of social infrastructure, violence. Robeson County, one of the most violent counties in our nation. So all of these themes are repeated here in this state. So what do I want you to take away from this talk? First, study history. Do that second major. I met with some people for lunch, and so they're getting called out. It's so important. And to understand poverty and disadvantage today, I know we're used to looking at the individual level, especially when we study families, but place matters. And in order to understand those patterns, you've got to crack the history book. Second, we really thrived from bringing together our nation's data infrastructure, the big data that's now available to us, bringing in history, but also the on-the-ground listening that comes from ethnography. And it was only by really bringing together these 3 methods that we could identify the mechanisms connecting the past to the present. Now, much further research should explore this. These are hypotheses with partial support, but they're novel, and they're things that we probably would not have thought of had we not combined these 3 sources of data. And finally, it's only by identifying the specific mechanisms that we can develop innovative policy solutions. So usually in policy, we go to a one-size-fits-all solution, but this deep listening and this attention to history really call out policy solutions that we might not have thought of before. So in the last chapter of the book, we spent a lot of time talking about what these policy solutions would be, both highbrow and low-hanging fruit. And of course, 2 that come out of today's talk are rather obvious. Invest in social infrastructure. The federal government can't do this. By statute, they're often prohibited from doing this, except they can invest in their libraries, and they're not doing that. The libraries are woefully underfunded. But there's nothing stopping the nation's 130,000 nonprofits from coming alongside of government and helping to restore those very important places in communities that will help create the net that can catch people when they fall. Second, the risk of elite capture is real. In so much of our policy history, we've assumed that local elite can be trusted. And then if we deliver the money to the community, that will flow into the pockets of the poor. And all too often, that is not what occurs. Instead, it is another opportunity for extraction. So sometimes people say, why do you study these places at all? Shouldn't we just give up on them? I point out that 60% of African Americans are now living in the South. 40% of Hispanics are in the 4 states bordering Mexico, including South Texas. Many Appalachians are return migrants coming home because the North didn't turn out so well. But in the end, I point to these pictures. So every year in Zavala County, Texas's county seat, Crystal City, they have a spinach festival. They have a spinach eating contest, medical waiver required. And they also crown at various ages spinach festival queens. And this is one of the queens from 2017. This is Redbird Mission in Clay County, Kentucky, just on the southern tip of Clay County. This is one of the original Presbyterian missions that came into the area to educate the children of subsistence farmers. And this little girl is learning a little bit of literacy, but she's also doing a little drawing of pictures when she's not supposed to at the Redbird Mission. This is in Marion County, South Carolina, where the community really does come together every year over one activity, and that is this fishing contest. And here, this little boy is getting his first taste of what it's like to catch the big one. And finally, this is an arts program in LaFleur County, Mississippi. This little boy is throwing his whole self, indeed his whole body, into the creation of art. So I'll stop there, invite Tim and Liv up, and we'll take, oh, by the way, they're here because this was team research. And if I just came, I would be misleading you. So most research is team research, right? And so we want to emphasize that point. So come on up and see if we have time for a few questions. You want to moderate?
We absolutely have time for questions, so feel free.
Interesting to know, what kind of social infrastructure do you think would be most helpful to because if they have nothing, right, we want to first make advancements on productive facilities, our parks, or if they are sports facilities, or they are pottery, bars or whatever, right? Do you have any idea of what that might look like?
So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to social infrastructure. Public libraries are something every community has, but in many communities, they don't have the money for adequate programming. They have almost no web presence, and they're really an underutilized resource. So here's something every community has. The term social infrastructure was coined by the sociologist Eric Kleinberg, who wrote about the New Paltz Library in Brooklyn. It's this amazing library where they teach adult literacy, they teach kids how to read, they help people apply for citizenship. The basement might be a playhouse. It's even sometimes a bowling alley for the elderly folks, virtual bowling league that's become immensely popular. And if you go to this community, it is literally pulsing with community life. The public libraries in these regions are like a ghost town. Yeah, they're often like a ghost town. And people use them for the internet, but that's about it. And there's very few books in some of our libraries there, especially in the Mississippi Delta. There may be just a couple of dozen books. So this is a super easy example of low-hanging fruit. We talked to one young waiter at a restaurant in Selma, Alabama, which is part of the Black Belt, about our research. We went to this really interesting diner that had used to be a whites-only diner, a private club, with at the door with a hole in it so they can exclude Black patrons. They had a new owner had ripped the door off in the 1980s and had integrated this restaurant. And this waiter got, so everybody comes and talks to you in these towns because you have, the wrong license plate. And so we got to talking with this waiter, and he says, if you come back to Selma, you have to bring something with you. And I said, okay, what is it? And he pauses and he says, a bowling alley. We need more of those around. And of course, if you're familiar with the famous bowling alone, this just necessarily rings a bell. But the modern equivalent of the bowling alley is the arcade. And we find in our research using the government of the census of businesses that arcades are really central to bringing young people together. So that would be a second idea. What you have to avoid, I think, is the Main Street initiatives that are organized towards tourists. And so, we've heard a lot in Greenwood, Mississippi, which has a beautiful downtown. The old Cotton Row has largely been renovated, and the city planners will talk about how they needed to create more Instagrammable moments for the tourists. And they had a balloon flying contest, and they had a bicycling race, and all of these things to bring tourists to town. But the local residents didn't use any of these things. And so thinking through what investments, community members can be imaginative. Thinking through what investments would mean the most to local people is really important. So they're doing some encouraging things in Clay. They're creating an outdoor recreation area for young people based on grant money they got from the Abandoned Mines Foundation. So there's kayaking and that kind of thing in this area that kids don't have a lot of access to otherwise. They're also building an area for storytelling where tourists and locals can come and share stories of growing up in Appalachia. But they also tore down one of the biggest centers of low-income housing to put in some Airbnbs. So, a mixed record of social infrastructure. Oh.
A lot of that theme, Kathy said to ask about the churches. So I'll just go ahead and preempt her and address that. So churches have tremendous potential to be places of social infrastructure. So as you saw in Manchester, it was a couple of pastors who got together. Beloved Ken Boland, who runs one of the most innovative sort of social service programs, which a lot of people are connected to. But often the problem with churches is that they're not socially inclusive. So a lot of the people Liv talked to say, I'm not welcome in these churches. Like, I don't have the right kind of clothes. I don't have a husband. Or, there's a lot of division that can happen, which is really too bad. I mean, one thing coming from the North, which is really fascinating about the South, is just how religious soaked the whole South is. Like, I'm convinced there's really no separation of church and state in the South, especially in this movement. That just doesn't happen in these areas. But so religion is like this common sort of thing, but when it's manifested in a local church, it can often be a place of exclusion, a place where the local elites show respectability and keep other people out. So to really think about that inclusive piece with in terms of local congregation.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Do you want to call on people to say? Them?
You're perfectly fine.
Okay.
Okay. Point out people.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks so much for the presentation. It's particularly interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about corruption. So one of the corruption cases you mentioned was Brett Fogg, and I guess was this like a statewide thing where funds for TANF were diverted? I'm curious, is corruption ever happening at the very, very local level?
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned like entire city councils were indicted, but do you think that local, small levels, like the local corruption is the mechanism, or is that big state level?
It's both, right? It's both. I mean, the corruption originated in a local area and then spread to an entire state. We only know about it because of Brett Favre. Otherwise, we would have missed the fact that $80 million of children's money was misappropriated. But in almost every case, there are rife examples of local corruption as well. So, for example, and Liv's going to speak to this point too, Clay County or Crystal City, Texas, which is the county seat of Zavala, has such a reputation for corruption that fracking is booming the economy right now. And there are new hotels and new restaurants all kinds of infrastructure, new apartments growing up all around this region to accommodate the temporary workforce that's being drawn into the area. Not a single amenity is located in Crystal City. So corruption is a killer because if companies can't trust government, they can't invest in a place. So yes, there was, we were just talking about this at lunch. We had 2 lunch guests with who are from these areas talking about the instances of very local, the sheriff's department, the director of the Child Protection Agency. So yes, it's very, very local. But Mississippi is the most corrupt state in the nation by almost any measure in any year. So state level corruption often reflects the accumulation of local level corruption.
Yeah, on that point. So just to talk a little bit more about local level corruption in response to your question, I want to sort of outline 2 examples of corruption in Clay County to talk about what the actual consequences of that local corruption end up being, because it's not just, disenchantment with federal or state government, it's a very local disenchantment. So in Clay County, the case that we flashed up on the screen was honestly one of the truest RICO cases I've ever heard of, because it truly was a cohort of this group called the Clay 8, who were very intentionally and deliberately and with the use of local elite money manipulating the election results. We talked to so many people who said, yeah, I get paid $20 by someone outside the polling station to vote a certain way. That's how blatant and deep the corruption is. At the same time, a lot of these places have huge issues with police corruption. So again, in the example of Clay County, one of the stories that we heard frequently was that there had been a major drug bust that was supposed to be executed. When they arrived, the house had already been completely cleared out. The most recent call on the phone that they could access was from the local police. So the police, someone in the department, had called ahead to warn the drug dealers to clear out before this bust. So what does that do to local belief in governance? It completely eradicates it. When we talk to people living in Clay County who had these experiences with vote buying or who had heard these stories about the police, they simply had no faith in any level of government left. Government doesn't mean a thing to them. It's just the local elites who are dictating who can get what job and paying for your votes in polls. So I think Kathy's point that this is a multi-level corruption issue is super important, but understanding what that means for people on the ground really helps illuminate why some of this corruption is able to persist, because people just lose faith.
So how do you break a cycle of corruption when people refuse to pay the government? Only participate less in it as a result? How do you break that cycle? Is it just local organizing and turning out more people to vote in the future and participate in local politics? How do you overcome that?
One of the reasons we include the Brett Favre case is because one little reporter, Anna Wolf, noticed the fact that only 3% of TANF applicants were getting approved and decided to investigate and blew the whole scandal open, and as a result has now won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So there's definitely a watchdog role for local and especially nonprofit journalism. Some of the for-profit journalism is owned by the local elites, so not as effective as many of the nonprofit, like Mississippi.com and Alabama.com, just have really good reporting on these issues. But second, we can change how we send money to communities, right? Do we assume that local government is the right vehicle to direct monies to these places? Or do we send money directly to people? Is it better to fund? This is a kind of a famous example. Laura Tock, a sociologist at Cornell, added up all of the federal governments going to counties and found that the best predictor of whether a county gets monies from the federal government is the poverty rate, which is natural because you have to be a poor county to get the money. But right after that was the number of nonprofits in the community, meaning you got to have the grant writers. But often in these small communities that don't have grant writers, it's the local elites who cook up the schemes. And actually, those communities often get nothing. But when they do they often line the pockets of those elites. So in Tunica County, Mississippi, the area that's gotten more federal money per person than any other county in the country, they used the $17,000 for every man, woman, and child in the county. That's how big this money coming into this county was, to build a pipe factory that provided about 270 local low-wage jobs. But in that same year, this boondoggle opened. The local casino closed, shedding 13,000 jobs. So we need expertise, not cronyism. We have all kinds of ideas in the book about how you might use extension services to help communities develop plans that are based on science. We probably need to revive regional science within economics, which has kind of fallen by the wayside. So there are definitely things we can do. We can also get new people to run. There was a reform mayor, Carmen Lewis, in Clay County, who really cleaned things up and actually cooperated with the RICO investigation and helped send the last wave. There have been wave upon wave of corrupt officials to jail, and kind of stopped the flow of these corrupt officials into public office. So there are a lot of programs that are doing this. They're helping young people, new people who are not beholden to entrenched elites to run, but they need to learn how to govern as well. Because we saw in Zavala County that new people did run. The Hispanics, the Mexicanos, the Chicanos, as they come to call themselves, took over from the Anglos. But they didn't know how to govern. Many of them had less than a 5th grade education, and the city books were a mess. So teaching people how to govern is something more policy schools should do, and we don't do it. We don't train local office holders. So I think that's a new role for us as elite institutions, to lend our expertise at the local level as well as at the national and state level. All the way in the back row. That's you. It's just the food behind you.
Yeah, that got my question too. Thank you guys so much for this research. In Hitchcock, I'm a second year MPB here, and a lot of this resonates in part because I come from a rural background myself. In my case, it's 1,000 people, 70 miles to their stoplight. But a lot of these themes track, especially the term phrase you use around the ethos of extraction and exploitation. That's something that's running through my mind. I think it really captures not only the lack of material conditions that are endemic of poverty, but also the ways in which these kind of mono economies have shaped people's understanding of their place in the world.
Yeah.
And, like in my town's example, it was like the timber industry went away and then everyone blamed environmentalists. And the idea that anything other than exploited monoculture of possibility seemed beyond people's social imagination. So I'm wondering, when you talk about some of these hometown heroes that you mentioned, were there any particular characteristics of people that enabled them to strive for something other than replicating one form of exploitation with another?
So I think the story here is kind of promising. In every community, maybe except Appalachia, there were people that had gone away, gotten credentials, excelled in their professions, whether it be in higher education or engineering or in the military or what have you. And many of the new leadership class, which is mostly drawn from the minority have-not group, have come back home. And so if you look at the new leadership in these places, it's Black and brown leadership. And these are highly skilled people. They're often more highly educated than the local elite. They have excellent regional and even national networks, and they're determined to give back. So we talk about these folks in the book, but they're the future of these communities. And to the degree that we can help boost their their generative spirits, that would be a very good thing. You know, in Greenwood, Mississippi, Father Mikulski was a priest who was really central in supporting the civil rights movement. In fact, he bailed Stokely Carmichael when he was still called that out of jail, right around the time that he gave the Black Power speech. But the community center he ran had fallen into disuse. And this couple who had gained much success in Memphis, but the husband, Ernest, was from Greenwood, heard that this community center was up for sale, and through GoFundMe and every other means necessary, their entire retirement savings bought this community center. And they've reopened it to the community of South Greenwood. So another leader, Tamala Boyd Shaw, very similar story. She had really become a leader in the national charter movement, but she was from Greenwood. And when she went to college, she realized she was 4 grades below her peers. And she didn't want that to happen to other kids. And so she moved back to Greenwood, and the La Flora Legacy Academy is the result. And what's interesting is that the white elites in town have been very supportive of these new leaders for the most part. Not all of the politicians, not all of the school board members, but there is some recognition among the elites that if things don't change, the community will die. So I think it's a great moment for intervention. Not only that, but we have more money because of the infrastructure bill and other federal monies available to pour into local communities now than we've ever had. So there's absolutely no excuse to begin directing some more of those monies to places of greatest need. Well, one other thing I wanted to say, and I'm so glad you're from a small town too, is we did also we did a huge driving tour of all of the places of deep disadvantage. We covered right after the pandemic was over and our university allowed us to travel for research. We got into the car and drove to 150 of the 200 most disadvantaged counties in America. It was really interesting, including all of the ones in North Carolina. But we also toured then last summer the most advantaged counties. And of course, you can guess where they are. Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin. So how were those economies formed? 2-word answer. Homestead Act. Okay, there was logging, yeah. Paul Bunyan and all. But the Homestead Act. And what's amazing about the Homestead Act is everybody, my grandfather was a homesteader at the very end of homesteading went on for a long time. But everybody's farm was the same size. And when you drive around South Texas, the reason the fields are so vast is you have one owner controlling all of the land. Same with the Mississippi Delta. But there are the twinkling lights of little farms. You can maybe see 6 or 7 of them anywhere you look in this area. And when we looked more deeply into these areas, because first of all, we thought, oh, wow, our index isn't working. They have the lowest rate of separate schooling, and they invest more in their schools on average than other states. They have very low rates of violence. The violence that we saw in the South is unheard of in most of these communities. Very low rates of public corruption, very high rates. They've lost social infrastructure too, but at a much slower rate than many of these other places. And so all of the mechanisms that are working against the internal colony communities are working for these communities in the upper Midwest. And, yes, they are majority white, but there are many majority white places in the nation not experiencing these advantages. For example, the uppermost Maine and the uppermost Northeast, where they did not have this pattern of widespread land ownership, where everybody owned land and resources and there were no caps. There's also very little wealth in these areas, but very little poverty. So very small, very good scores on the GD index. So people really seem to thrive when crime is low, inequality is low, Corruption is unheard of, at least to the extent that we described in this book. Yeah.
So I imagine that these communities that you're looking at in like the north and west, were also rural, right?
Yes, they were also rural.
About how like a rural community is also a factor, at least in the south.
Exactly.
Poverty. So is there, in addition to the Homestead Act and like general equity in these places, are there other factors that are leading to better scores in these methods?
Yeah, I think all of the mechanisms that are working against those places are working for these places. So Tim is going to give a lecture to a group of nonprofits in Nebraska on Tuesday. And what's he going to say? Right now, you have all these advantages. Nebraska is like an unbelievably advantaged state. It's very interesting politics, but it's guard your social infrastructure. You know, you're a group of nonprofits. You can come alongside government. Government does a lot in rural communities, but it can't do that. You can come alongside and make sure, that the arcade stays in business. Or that the local, you can advocate for library funds, or you can help support program in your local library. That kind of thing, I think, is very powerful. But you also see very high rates of intergenerational mobility in these neighborhoods, in these areas. That's why violence is so low. So you don't like when fracking comes to the Dakotas, you run the risk of increasing violence because you've created a mono economy. And anything that limits mobility or recreates this sort of company town is a real danger to a place. So you want to think about economic development as an effort to diversify your economy, not to build it at any cost. So those are just some examples. Yeah. Suchak, and then your friend next to you.
Yeah, something about what you just said makes me think I've been in a lot of cities that I would not consider are well off. And so we're talking about rural communities, and I also grew up in a rural community. But I'm wondering, since you analyzed your data at the county and city level, if there's something that might show up if you analyzed it at a neighborhood or census tract level that might bring up other insights about inner city poverty that's different than rural poverty, but it doesn't mean that it's like that maybe it's apples and oranges, or there might be a different set of mechanisms there. But I'm wondering if that's like a future research thing, or if you guys had looked at that, or if that was like the limitation of what we were able to look at.
So as sociologists, we've almost only studied neighborhoods. We've not been studying whole communities. So, and we've been doing that research for 20 years, looking at neighborhood effects and patterns within cities. And that research is so important. And it's, we're spending time looking at anti-violence programs right now on the southwest side of Chicago. Oh my gosh, that's a really poor, disadvantaged place. But it has the advantage of public transportation. You have school choice. If you can get to a healthcare center, there's relatively good healthcare. Your state has Medicaid expansion. If you're in a city like San Francisco, you might be paying a lot for rent, but the cost of living incorporates all of these benefits that you simply don't have in the Mississippi Delta. If you live in Bolivar County, Mississippi, and you need to get to a hospital, you have to drive to the county line for an ambulance to meet you, to take you to the hospital in Greenville or Jackson. So, I don't want to pit one against the other, but I'm just, that research I think is going on, and it's very rich, but that research leaves out rural places. And so I think that's the major reason we decided to go with counties and cities. There are cities in the top 100, and they're the cities, interestingly enough, that when depopulation hit these internal colonies, these are the communities where people came. I think especially in the case of Appalachians. So, we have Cleveland, Detroit, Flint, Rochester, New York, Buffalo, Gary, Indiana. One of my former, we own homes in we've owned homes in 3 of the top 300 most disadvantaged places in the nation, turns out. We've never made much on our real estate. Camden, New Jersey, Trenton, where we live now, Baltimore, Maryland. So it's not like there aren't cities on this list. And oftentimes those cities too, especially those in the upper Midwest, have also had these mono-economies. So there are some echoes of this analysis and high levels of corruption and so on. So yes, neighborhoods are really important, but like within Greenwood, Mississippi, the north side is a different world than the south side. And no doubt there are mobility differences, although we don't have the data to test that. So we also don't have data on, things like life expectancy is low birth weight and mobility. That you can't look at that reliably in some of these smaller units of geography, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I just also want to give kind of a structural methodological answer as well, because I think one of the things that makes counties and cities so difficult to compare to each other is not just the differences in the infrastructure, but it's also whether or not you have a certain overlap of community boundaries and government boundaries. So one of the things that Kathy had mentioned towards the start of the presentation was when you meet someone from the South, often they'll tell you, or at least from a rural place in the South, they'll often tell you what county they're from. One thing we pretty consistently find is that in Southern places, there is a sense of community attached, not necessarily just to the town, but to the county as a whole. And in these cases, that community's boundaries really line up with the boundaries of power in a place, the boundaries of governance, of service provision, stuff like that. Whereas in cities, part of what actually really complicates our neighborhood research is the permeability of neighborhood boundaries. Even in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in Chicago, people can physically access the wealthier areas. Often they work in those places. Sometimes they might even be able to send their children to school in those places, which is getting into more of that infrastructure issue. But you don't have this same overlap of the community boundaries and the government boundaries. So it creates a very different situation when we're looking at some of these government factors and political factors that go into these mechanisms.
Thank you. Thank you both.
I met Liv when she was a first-year grad student because she got coffee early like I did. And I didn't know her at all. And I said, "Hi, I'm Kathryn Edin. Do you want to go live in Clay County, Kentucky this summer?" That was my line. And she said yes. Yeah.
Drink coffee.
Oh, you're next, and then behind you, and then right up here.
Thank you so far for the presentation and the free books. My question goes back on that logic of exploitation, and especially with those mono economies. And as you mentioned, in more modern times, the company controlled town, right? So my question is more on how are communities supposed to shift those economies from this cycle of exploitation, and more specifically, push back from companies.
Okay, now look at North Carolina again.
So tell me about for those of you who know, tell me about the economy of these places between the post-war period and, say, 1990.
Well, I've had textile mills.
Textiles and manufacturing, right? Lots and lots. So the economy shifted, and these economies were relatively diverse. What happened in the 1990s and the 2000s? Access. Got it out? Outsourced to other countries because of trade policy.
I know. I was going to shout it out. So, NAFTA is easily one of the most controversial policies we've had in the U.S. Some economists will argue that there's been a net benefit, but it's in these very counties, those on our map, where the job losses were greatest. And so these exact places who were trying to recover from a mono economy were the ones that were the hardest hit. And literally, it devastated the economy of these places. And this is true all across the South and into South Texas. That kind of manufacturing happened in some parts of Appalachia, like Western North Carolina, and the same thing happened there. Less so in Eastern Kentucky and Western West Virginia. They've kind of reorganized their economies, interestingly, around pain. But my point is that these policies have winners and losers, and the losers in this case have not been compensated. There's also really excellent research by David Otter from MIT showing that to the extent that counties lost jobs due to NAFTA, it was those counties, because, many of these counties used to vote Democratic because they trusted the Democrats on jobs. And to the degree that job loss was predominant in those communities, these were the communities that flipped from blue to red. So our politics have been shaped by these trade policies in ways that might lead to some of the polarization we're observing today. So we really need to think hard about this. And I think that there's, a lot of talk about bringing our supply chains home. There might be some real advantages to that. I am not an economist, so I'm not going to go too far down that road. But there have definitely been losers. And to the extent that we want these places to succeed, we have to give them a chance to succeed, which probably means making some adjustments or finding some other way of compensating the losers.
Two more questions, and then we'll have a chance to mingle informally.
Is there any correlation between good outcomes and high quality healthcare? For instance, Southern Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic sees 8,000 to 9,000 people a day, and they cover Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, and Iowa, which are.
Yep. Yeah.
So you'll notice that other than, well, now North Carolina, the economy is finished, right? So we can say nice things about them. But other than Central Appalachia, which adopted Medicaid expansion right away, rural hospitals are closing in all of these regions. The quality of even primary health care
is going down. There are no OBGYN clinics, even if there is a hospital in many of these places. So the central functions of our healthcare system are literally crumbling. Mississippi, I think, is the starkest example, but it's happening all across
these regions and into South Texas as well. What we see, interestingly, in Central Appalachia,
where the economy has really reorganized around pain. Take the 13 pharmacies in Manchester, Kentucky, a city of 180 people, but also the health clinics. The hospitals are growing. Advent Health is now the largest employer in Eastern Kentucky. So the healthcare system is growing. You still can't get specialty care in Appalachia unless you go to Lexington. One of the reasons Patrick O'Keefe writes in Empire of Pain, opioids were such a popular prescription all the way back to when it was in another form way back in the day of morphine, is that when you can't get people to go to a physical therapist and engage in all of these other activities to improve their health, which requires specialist care, you give them pills because you're a primary care physician and that's the only tool you have. So I wouldn't say that the quality of healthcare is great in states that have expanded Medicaid, that are still very poor and rural, but they're ample. And again, the healthcare industry is booming. Maybe another form of extraction still, but pain is now. This is also the biggest disability problem in the United States, especially Lake County. So in some ways,
The economy is organized around disability, pain, drug abuse, that kind of thing. So we really don't see that in these other regions.
It's really a tale of two cities. In North Carolina, you're a much more prosperous area than central Appalachia. So your healthcare the access will probably improve in ways that are really meaningful. You have more urban centers that are easily accessible. So I think that's a really, you probably won't see your economy reorganizing around pain in the way that's happening in Eastern Kentucky. You are next and last.
Yeah. What do you think is the root cause of corruption?
Power. But I you what's your name in the very back? Ian. I think you put it better than we did. It becomes the way things are done. And vote buying is rife in Eastern Kentucky. It always has been. The coal companies got that started, and it's just the way things are done. The respondent said, well, I'm really not going to vote because I don't trust any of them. But if you give me 40 and he gives me 20, I'm going to vote for him, or I'm going to vote for you. So there is just a sense of this is the way things are. There's nothing I can do about it. We did not find a lot of engagement in national politics in these places. Maybe in part because there was such a disillusionment with local politics. But, we're hopeful that I think we are not going to see Brandon Presley win the governorship. But who knows? Okay, let's mingle. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you for the wonderful presentations, the insightful answers to the questions. Thank you both for being here today. I invite everyone to stay here and like people in the back of the room. We'll move to the chairs so there's room to stay. And we look forward to welcoming you back to future Center for Child and Family Policy events. Thanks, everyone.
Here. I'll give y'all a call break.
Yeah.